The war had a smell. Marcus Hale had been in enough of them to know. It was not the smell of blood or burning, those were just side effects. The real smell of war was stale coffee, recycled air, and the particular sweat of men who had stopped sleeping properly 6 months ago and were no longer bothering to pretend otherwise. Veil 9 smelled exactly like that. Station hung in neutral space like something neither side wanted to claim and neither side wanted to abandon. And GT clears throat. And GT 8 months of ceasefire, 8 months of two civilizations sitting across tables from each other, moving papers, saying words and not shooting, which counted as progress, which was by any honest measure the most exhausting kind of progress there was. Sergeant Marcus Hale had been assigned to Vale 9-3 weeks ago by a colonel who called it an honor and meant it as a punishment. Marcus had accepted the assignment with the same expression he used for everything, flat, watchful, waiting to see what kind of problem it became. He was 34. He had the kind of face that had once been unremarkable and was now just tired. Not old, tired in the specific way of a man who had seen the same thing enough times that surprise had quietly packed its bags and left. He walked with a slight drag in his left leg from a case plasma graze at Outpost 11 that the medics said had healed fine and that his leg disagreed with every morning. His official title on Vale 9 was Cultural Liaison 3rd grade. He had no idea what that meant. Nobody did. The posting existed because someone in Terran command had decided that a ceasefire required humans who could stand in the same room as the Kaith without visibly wanting to kill them, and Marcus had a service record that suggested he was capable of extraordinary self-control. What it did not mention was that his self-control came not from discipline, but from a deep personal policy of not caring about things he couldn't change. The Kaith were tall. That was the first thing most humans noticed, and the last thing that actually mattered. The Kaith Dominion's Queen Empress Saravan stood 2 heads above the tallest man on the station and moved the way expensive machinery moved. No wasted motion, no hesitation, every step calculated 3 steps ahead. Her exoskeletal plating was the dark blue-gray of deep ocean, and her 4 upper limbs moved with a fluid independence that still made human eyes track them involuntarily, the brain trying to resolve them into something familiar and failing. She had been on Vale 9 for 6 weeks. She had agreed to nothing in 6 weeks. Her advisors called this strategic patience. The Terran negotiators called it deliberate obstruction. Marcus, who watched her from across briefing rooms and corridors and the occasional neutral meal period with the practiced disinterest of a man who observed everything, thought it was something else. He thought she was doing exactly what he was doing, waiting to see what kind of problem this became. He didn't say that to anyone. It wasn't his job to say things. His job was to stand near doors and look unthreatening and occasionally translate idioms when the Kaith interpreters missed the human sarcasm embedded in what was supposed to be a formal statement. He was good at that. He had a gift for hearing what was underneath what was said. It had kept him alive in 6 different combat zones and had made him very poor company at social gatherings. The assassination attempt happened on a Thursday. Marcus later thought there was something appropriately undramatic about that. Not a battle day, not a high ceremony, not even a formal negotiating session. Thursday. The Queen Empress was walking back from a private communications suite toward her quarters, accompanied by two of her Imperial Guard and one flustered advisor who was trying to brief her on something while also trying to keep up with her stride. And Marcus happened to be coming the other way. He registered the movement in his peripheral vision. Before he understood it, 3 figures. Wrong corridor access codes. He didn't consciously process this, but his body did, the way a body does after enough years of noticing who belongs where. They were Kaith, hardliner faction based on the ritual scarring along the neck plates, a detail he'd been briefed on once and filed away without expecting to need. Plasma pistols, small, short range, the kind used for things you needed to call accidents. The bolt was already fired before Marcus was conscious of deciding anything. He moved the way he had learned to move, not thought, just physics, the geometry of bodies in a corridor and where the line between weapon and target could be interrupted. He put himself into it. The bolt caught him across the left side of his chest and threw him into the wall, and then onto the floor, and then he was lying there looking at the ceiling of Vale 9's corridor C7, which was a very standard station ceiling, and thinking with the strain clarity that comes right after the body has absorbed something it shouldn't have survived. That was the same side as the leg. His luck was remarkably consistent. The Queen's guards neutralized the attackers in the following 4 seconds. He was aware of this distantly, the way you're aware of weather through window. He was mostly occupied with the ceiling and breathing and the specific question of whether his heart was doing something wrong or whether it always felt like this, and he'd simply never noticed. The first thing Saravan said, standing over him, was informal Kaith. Her advisor translated it slightly. Pale. Is it alive? Marcus, who understood enough Kaith to have caught the original, said yeah. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You moved into the line of fire, she said, this time in standard, accented but precise, each word placed like something being set down carefully on a surface she wasn't sure would hold it. Yes, Marcus said, that was not logical. No. You are a cultural liaison. You are not assigned to my protection detail. Also correct. Something moved across her face. He didn't have enough experience with Kaith expressions to name it. He filed it away. Why? She asked. He thought about it for the length of one honest breath. You were in the way of it, he said, and I wasn't doing anything else. She was quiet for long enough that her advisor began to look nervous. Bring it to the medical suite, she said. It. Marcus noted the pronoun with the detached interest of a man who'd been called worse. The medics came. There was a stretcher. There was a great deal of pain that he organized into a quiet room inside himself and closed the door on. The ceiling of C7 rolled past, and then the ceiling of the medical wing, and then the lights above a Kaith medical platform that smelled of something biological and faintly sweet. He didn't lose consciousness, which the Kaith medics seemed to find puzzling. It should be under, one of them said, apparently not knowing he understood. It's rude, Marcus said, to talk about someone in front of them. The medic looked at him. He looked back. He was put into the healing bath an hour later. Warm liquid, bioluminescent, the specific blue-green of something that didn't exist on Earth. They told him it would repair the tissue. Damage, they told him it would take 3 to 5 days of immersion. They told him several other things that he did not retain because he was very tired and the ceiling was doing something interesting with the light nobody told him about. The other things the bath would do. Nobody thought they needed to. Marcus Hale closed his eyes in the healing bath. On Veil 9 on a Thursday, and the war, which had already changed once without asking his permission, began to change. Again, it didn't consult him about that. Either, Saravan told herself she visited. For political reasons, she was good at. This she had been telling herself. Political reasons for most of her adult life, and had constructed an entire interior architecture around the habit. Every choice had a justification that fit inside the framework of the Dominion's needs. Every feeling that arrived without paperwork was filed under strategic consideration times, and processed accordingly. She visited the human on the second day because he had taken a plasma bolt intended for her, and it would be politically useful to demonstrate that the Dominion honored such things. She visited on the third day because his condition required monitoring, and she had questions about human physiological recovery rates that her medics were too cautious to ask directly. She visited on the fourth day because she had been walking past the corridor anyway. The human was awake each time, which continued to puzzle her. Medics. He lay in the healing bath with the bioluminescent fluid up to his collar and his eyes tracking her the moment she entered the room, the same way they had tracked the assassins in the corridor, not alarmed, just noting, cataloging the eyes of something that had learned that noticing things before they became problems was the only reliable survival strategy. You're back, he said on the fourth day. Queen Empress visits as she chooses, her advisor said from behind her left shoulder. Sure, Marcus said. He didn't say it with disrespect. He said it the way he seemed to say most things, as a word placed down, finished, taking up no more space than it needed. She dismissed her advisor. This caused the advisor visible distress, which she noted and set aside. She sat in the low chair that her medics had placed beside the bath. Placed it without being asked, she had noticed, which told her something about how observable her visits had become, and looked at the human. How do you feel, she asked, like someone shot me. That is accurate. How do you feel, he asked. The question landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Nobody asked her that, not her council, not her advisors, not the generals who reported casualty numbers to her with the specific flatness of men who had decided she didn't require softening. Her own court had not asked her that question in years. The asking of it had been quietly understood to be a kind of impertinence. That is not a relevant inquiry, she said. Okay, he said. He didn't push. She found that strange. Every diplomatic interaction she had been party to in the last 8 months involved some form of pushing someone, trying to move her, steer her, extract something. This human who had thrown himself in front of a weapon 3 days ago for reasons he himself had described as essentially incidental, seemed to have no agenda beyond the one he was visibly running. They talked not about the war. The first time she had expected the war, had her deflections ready, and was briefly disoriented when he asked instead about the station's recycled air quality and whether it affected Keth biology differently than human biology. It was a small question. It had no Diplomatic leverage anywhere in it, she answered it. He listened in the particular way he had completely, without preparing his next sentence. While she spoke, on the 5th day they argued. It started with the war and escalated through sovereignty and arrived finally question she had not intended to let into the conversation, whether the ceasefire was a genuine pause or just the war holding its breath. It's holding its breath. Marcus said, "You are certain?" And GT clears throat. And GT, I've been in enough of them. Ceasefires that turn into peace feel different. The air changes. This air hasn't changed, and whose failure is that? Both sides equally. She had expected him to say the Keth. Every Terran she had negotiated with, every general, every ambassador, every cultural liaison who was really just a soldier in a different collar had a version of this argument that ended with Keth intransigence as the root problem. This human said, with the flatness of a man reading from a list of facts, "You are not defending your own civilization," she said. "I'm not in the habit of defending things that are wrong just because they're mine." She left that day more annoyed than she had arrived, which was beginning to be a consistent pattern that she had filed under times, irrelevant times, and was running out of room for. The physician came to see her on the 6th day. He was her most senior medical officer, a man of 40 years of careful service who had delivered bad news before and showed the specific marks of it the way he stood when he entered. Wait slightly forward, the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say more than once. "Majesty," he said. She waited. The humans immersion in the regenerative bath. He paused. There have been interactions, biochemical, between the bath compounds and his biology. Another pause. And yours, explain that. He explained it. It took 6 minutes. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, the room was very quiet. The regenerative bath used by Keth Queens was not the same formula used for standard subjects. It carried compounds specific to royal biology, compounds that, in 40,000 years of Keth medical history, had only ever operated in the presence of other Keth. The assumption of species exclusivity had been so total that no protocol existed to address its absence. The humans' biology, submerged, proximity sustained, had interacted with those compounds in a way that her own biology had interpreted as something else entirely. There was an old Keth word for it, a word from the early histories, before the Dominion, before even the Empire, from the days when queens did not choose dynastically, but chose as the body chose. Velson, the recognition. "You are certain," she clears throat said. "The tests are unambiguous, Majesty." She stood very still for a long time. "Leave," she said. He left. She stood in the empty room, and the information sat in the air around her, the way debris sits after an explosion, visible, undeniable, still warm from the force of its arrival. She was, by the mechanisms of her own ancient biology, carrying a child that was half Keth, half human, a thing that had no name in any taxonomy either civilization had yet written. Clears throat, the product of a plasma, bolts, a corridor, and a man who had moved because she was in the way, and he wasn't doing anything else. She sat down. The chair was her advisor's chair, and too small, and she sat in it anyway. The political consequences arranged themselves in her mind with horrible efficiency because her mind was efficient and had never once stopped working, not in grief, not in crisis. Not now. She saw the council's reaction. She saw the hardliners' reaction. She saw the Terran command's reaction. The ambassadors, the press, the 40 years of war history that would be used to frame this as something it wasn't. And then the 10 more years of war that framing would require. She saw all of it, and underneath all of it, quiet and without politics, a single thing her body knew before her mind caught up. Something was there. Something new. Something entirely without precedent. She sat in the small chair in the empty room for a long time. When she stood, her face was composed, her hands were still. No one watching her walk back through the corridor toward her quarters would have seen anything except the Queen Empress of the Keth Dominion, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had never been surprised by anything. She was under that. Absolutely terrified, she filed it under time's strategic consideration. The file was full, the Keth High Council found out on a Tuesday. This was in the long catalog of bad timing that Valen 9 had accumulated over 8 months of ceasefire diplomacy, the worst Tuesday yet. Saravan had been moving to control the information. She was good at control, had built her reign on the architecture of it. He had spent 15 years learning exactly how much truth to release and when and in what shape, so that the truth arrived already trimmed into something manageable. She had needed perhaps 3 more days. She had not gotten them. A junior medic with more loyalty to the council's intelligence apparatus than to the physician's discretion had talked, and the information had moved through Keth political networks the way fire moves through dry grass, without asking permission, without slowing for obstacles, without caring what was in the way. By the time she was informed that the council knew, they had already been deliberating for 2 hours. The session she walked into was not a session. It was a wound with chairs around it. There were 14 council members. 11 of them were speaking simultaneously when she entered, which was not technically permitted under Keth parliamentary procedure, but which had apparently ceased to matter approximately 90 minutes ago. The other 3 were sitting with the very still expressions of men who had decided that the most powerful thing they could do right now was not move. She walked to the head of the table. She sat. The volume dropped, not because she commanded it. She said nothing, but because 15 years of watching her operate had taught this room that Saravan's silence was the most expensive thing in it. Majesty, said Counselor Vurath, the oldest and the one most committed to the fiction that his anger was statesmanship. We require confirmation of the physician's report. The report is accurate, she said. The volume came back. She let it run for 30 seconds. Because 30 seconds was how long it took the ones without discipline to spend the edge of their outrage, and then she let the silence return, and this time it stayed. It is a contamination, Vurath said. It is a pregnancy, she said, by a human, by a Terran soldier who absorbed a plasma bolt that was addressed to me. Yes, the mechanism is irrelevant. The mechanism, she said, is the only thing that is relevant. There was no intention, no. She searched for the right word in standard, then returned to Keth. No breach of protocol. A biochemical interaction occurred in a medical environment that no one had legislated because no one had imagined it needed legislating. That is the complete truth of the situation. The complete truth, said Vurath, is that the Queen Empress of the Keth Dominion is carrying a half-human offspring, and the Terran diplomatic corps is currently in this station, and our enemies will use this. My enemies, she said, are in this room, quiet like a wall coming down. She let it sit. The Terran side of the station found out 4 hours later. Ambassador Creighton, who had been clears throat negotiating Keth-Terran relations for 11 years and had developed a specific expression for catastrophic surprises, a kind of blank, total stillness, like a man whose internal load-bearing structure had just been removed, called an emergency session of the Terran diplomatic mission, and spoke for 20 minutes and then sat down and didn't say anything. For another 10, Marcus was brought in by 2 junior attaches who could not meet his eyes. This was not a good sign. In his experience, people who could not meet your eyes were either about to arrest you or about to say something that made both parties wish they could pretend the conversation hadn't happened. He sat across the table from Ambassador Creighton. Creighton, clears throat, explained the situation. Marcus listened. When Creighton finished, the room was waiting for something, an explosion, a denial, some dramatic reaction that would give them all something to do with the energy of the situation. Marcus said, "Is she all right?" The room had no protocol for that question. It showed. Creighton opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Sergeant Hale, I don't think you understand I understand what you told me," Marcus said. "I'm asking about her specifically. Is she all right? The Queen Empress is. The situation is politically, that's not what I asked." Creighton looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man encountering a structural problem he hadn't accounted for. "We don't know," he said finally. "Honestly," Marcus nodded. He sat with that for a moment. Then, "What happens now?" "What happened now," Creighton explained, "was that Marcus was technically not under arrest, but was also not to leave the Terran section of the station. What happened now was that Terran Command was being briefed that the joint liaison protocols were being reviewed for any applicable precedent. There were none, and that the case Council was formally requesting, through back channels, a joint tribunal. Tribunal in this context meant a room full of people deciding whether Marcus should be held responsible for a plasma bolt and a medical bath, and the 38,000 years of Caith biology that had interpreted the combination in a way that neither civilization had written rules for. He was denied a meeting with Saravan. He requested it again. Denied again. Denied again. The aide who delivered the 4th denial did so by passing a written note under the door, which Marcus took to mean his personal presence at the denial was no longer something the aide was willing to participate in. He showed up anyway, not to her quarters. He wasn't interested in causing an incident on top of an incident. He went to the one place on Val 9 where the Caith and Terran sections shared neutral ground, the observation lounge at the station's center with its wide viewport and its recycled plants that weren't doing well under artificial light, and its 2 benches that faced different directions because no one had wanted to imply shared comfort. He sat on the human side bench. He waited. She came 40 minutes later. Her 2 guards stayed at the door. She crossed the room and sat on the Caith side bench, and they looked at each other across the viewport with the dead field stars between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. Your counsel wants this erased. He said, yes, what do you want? She looked at him. The question landed the same place it had before, the same small wound of an ordinary thing that had no business hitting like that. I have not, she said carefully, been asked that question enough times to have a quick answer. Take your time. She did. He waited. Outside the viewport, a cargo hauler was making its slow pass toward the docking ring, its running lights blinking patient and regular against all those uninterested stars. I don't know what it will be, she said. Half of each of us. No precedent. No category. She paused. My physicians cannot tell me what it will need, what it will think. Whether both biologies are compatible. The same body, that's frightening, he said. Yes, I'll stand wherever you put me, he said. Whatever you decide. You're the one carrying it. That's your ground to hold or give up. Not mine. Not your counsel's. She looked at him for a long time with an expression that he still did not have enough faith to read precisely. Every man in my orbit, she said very quietly, arrives with an answer already loaded. I don't have one, he said. I genuinely don't. I know. She stood, her guard straightened at the door. I will see you at the tribunal, she said. Okay, she left. Marcus sat alone in the observation lounge and watched the cargo hauler finish its docking approach, slow and deliberate and entirely unconcerned with any of the things happening inside the station. The stars did what stars do. He sat with the weight of the thing. Not with panic, not with denial, but with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to meet whatever comes and is simply waiting for it to arrive. The tribunal was in 2 days. He had been called worse things than times it. He had walked into worse rooms than this. One, he had survived 6 combat zones and 1 plasma bolt and 38,000 years of Caith biology deciding something about him without his input. He figured he could survive a tribunal. He was characteristically both right and wrong about that. Saravan kept the child. She announced it to the council on a morning when the recycled air on Val 9 tasted particularly stale and the light in the council chamber was doing something unflattering to everyone's faces. She walked in, sat down, and said it without preamble, without the diplomatic wrapping she usually decisions that were going to cause pain. Just the fact, clean and final. The council's response was not a surprise. She had modeled it in advance the hours the previous night when she couldn't sleep and had instead run the conversation forward in her mind, playing every voice in that room, every argument, every pressure point, every threat, both spoken and unspoken. She had heard all of it before it was said. This meant that when it was said, it had already been processed. She listened with the patience of a woman who was not actually listening, but was waiting for the end of something she had already moved past. Varith called it a defilement of the royal line. She let him finish. 3 others argued. Succession law that a half-human heir had no standing, no precedent, no legal framework under which it could inherit or represent the dominion. She agreed with this assessment and told them evenly that new frameworks had been written before and would be written again. One counselor, young enough to still believe that plain argument would work on her, said the simplest version, that the dominion would fracture that there were border lords who had been looking for a reason, that this would be the reason. Yes, she said. The room expected more. There wasn't more. She had looked at the fracture coming and said times, yes, times with the same tone she used for weather reports. And now she was waiting for them to catch up. She was done asking the Dominion for permission to be what she was. The fracture came in 6 weeks. 3 border lords, Caith hardliners with old money, old grudges, and armies that had been sitting under use since the ceasefire declared the Queen Empress compromised, unfit. The word they used was a Caith legal term that translated roughly as times contaminated by foreign claim, and they had dusted it off from a law written 400 years ago to address Queen who had been politically captured by a rival empire. The law had never been used. They were using it now. They moved against the capital station at Val 9 because she was there, and it was simpler than waiting for her to come home. Marcus found out about it the same way he found out about most things on Val 9, by being in a corridor when something happened and his body registering it before he consciously chose to engage. The docking alarms were a specific pitch. He knew that pitch. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the defense response. He was a cultural liaison. 3rd grade, technically under voluntary restriction since the tribunal, with no standing in any military action involving Caith forces on either side. He went anyway. He found the head of Saravan's Imperial Guard, a Caith veteran named Saravel, who had been doing this job for 20 years and had the specific expression of someone managing too many problems with too few people, and said simply, "Where do you need a body?" Saravel looked at him for a moment. "You understand these are Caith forces," she said. "Not Terran. This is not your fight by any legal framework. I understand that." Marcus said, "You were shot 8 weeks ago." "I'm aware." She looked at him for another 2 seconds, then corridor 7 has a breach team working a soft entry. They'll be through the seal in 4 minutes. He went to corridor 7. What followed was not a battle in any cinematic sense. There was no wide field, no dramatic charge. It was close and dark and loud in the particular way of pressurized environments where sound had nowhere to go. Marcus worked a choke point with 2 of Soravel's guards and a plasma rifle. That was technically Caith military issue, and therefore not supposed to be in his hands, and he did it the way he did most difficult things, without artistry, without inspiration, with the grinding patience of a man who had decided on an outcome and was simply going to work toward it until it occurred, or he couldn't anymore. He nearly died twice. The first time was a close thing, a bolt that caught the wall 6 inches from his head and left a smell like burned copper that stayed in his nose for days. The second time was less close, but took a chunk out of his right shoulder that the Caith medic who patched him up later referred to as times significant tissue lost times, in a tone that suggested this was a professional understatement. The attack was repelled. Not cleanly, not bloodlessly, but completely. Saravan found him in the medical bay afterward. Same bay as before, different table. His right arm was in a brace, and the medic had given him something for the pain that was making the lights slightly more interesting than usual. She stood at the foot of the table. "You were told to stay in the Terran section," she said. "Yes, you went to corridor 7 with a Keth rifle. It was available. You were shot. Also true, she was quiet. For a moment, her hands the upper set, the ones that most Keth kept still. During formal interactions were not. Still, one of them moved to the edge of the table and stopped there, not touching, and he noticed it and she noticed him noticing it, and neither of them said anything about it. Why do you keep doing this? She said. It was not entirely a question. He thought about it with the honesty that the pain medication was making slightly easier, same reason as the first time. He said, "You were in the way of something and I wasn't doing anything else." A pause. I'm not trying to be simple about it. I don't have a better answer than that. You could have been killed. I'm aware of that. I've been aware of it every time. It doesn't change the math. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was lying in a Keth medical bay with a piece of his shoulder missing, and he was thinking with a particular lucidity that the medication was cutting through. Two, that he had been in 6 wars and had never once understood what he was fighting toward. It had always been away from the thing that would kill you, away from the ground you were told to hold, away from the version of tomorrow where your people lost. He had never had a toward. He was beginning to suspect he had one now. He filed this under Times things to examine when not bleeding Times and closed the folder. Meanwhile, Saravon's chief geneticist had released preliminary findings that were being passed through the council with the careful speed of documents that everyone understood were explosive. The child's neural scans, taken at 12 weeks, the first clean window the Keth medical system allowed, showed something the geneticist's report described in the flat language of scientific documentation as Times unprecedented bilateral architecture, the Keth hive resonance, the deep biological communion that bound Keth social structure was present, and alongside it, fully integrated, not conflict, the discrete individual consciousness that defined human cognition, not a hybrid of two things fighting for space, two things that had found a way to exist in the same brain and were apparently doing so without difficulty. The geneticist, who was not given to dramatic language, had added a single personal note at the bottom of the report outside the formal documentation. I have no category for this. I'm not certain our science has one yet. Veroth had looked at that report and called it evidence of pollution. Saraval had looked at it and been quiet for a long time. Saravon had looked at it and felt underneath the policy and the crisis and the political wreckage that was still being cleared from Corridor 7. Something small and precise and without any political use whatsoever, something that might, in a different life, in a life where she had been allowed to feel things in their actual shape, have been called pride. She did not say this to Marcus. She said, "The council is drafting a new succession framework." "Good," he said. "It will take years." "Most good things do." She looked at his bandaged shoulder. He looked at her hand, still at the edge of the table, still not touching. "You're going to keep doing this," she said, "aren't you? Every corridor, every problem?" "Probably," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something she had not done since before the throne, since before the Dominion had shaped her into the thing it needed. She let a conversation end without managing it, without steering it toward a conclusion that served something. She just let it be what it was. She walked out of the medical bay. At the door she stopped. Marcus, she said. He waited. Don't get shot again. I'll do my best. He said. She left. He lay in the Keth medical bay with his missing shoulder and his lit-up pain medication and the news about the child's brain sitting somewhere under everything else. Patient, unclassified, waiting for the world to build a word for it, he thought. It could probably wait. It had already proven it was in no hurry. 22 years. That was how long it had taken the world to build the word. The word, when it finally arrived, was a name: Kale Voss. Kale from the Terran side, soft, single syllable, something you could say quickly in a corridor and have it carry. And Voss from the Keth, a queen suffix, the mark of line and blood and the right to stand in certain rooms. Together they made something that belonged to both and neither, which was appropriate because that was precisely what she was, Keth. Scholars had spent 22 years arguing about her taxonomy. The debates were published in journals with titles that took longer to say than most political speeches. She had read all of them. She found them interesting in the way that a map is interesting to someone who already knows the territory, useful for understanding how other people see the ground, less useful for actually walking on it. Kale Voss had been walking on complicated ground since she could walk. She was tall the way her mother was tall, with the long-limbed efficiency of Keth structure, but her build was closer to her father's, broader, denser, something more planted about the way she stood. Her exoskeletal plating was partial, soft at the edges, a pale gray-blue that did not fit any standard Keth category. Her face was her father's face, run through a different filter, same watchful eyes, same economy of expression, same habit of letting conversations sit without filling them. She had her mother's hands, the upper set, expressive, precise, in her father's hands, the lower set, callous, built for holding things. She had the Keth hive resonance. She could feel the biological communion of Keth society, the faint networked awareness that bound them, the current running under the formal language of politics. She had also her father's individual consciousness, the fully discrete, separate, this is mine alone times architecture that Keth brains did not normally accommodate. In her they ran simultaneously, like two rivers that had been told they couldn't share a valley and had simply ignored the instruction. This gave her advantages that neither civilization had prepared for. She knew what the council wanted before they said it. She knew what the Terran ambassadors feared before they asked their first question. She could sit in a room and feel the shape of the political weather, the way her father had once felt the movement of wrong bodies in a corridor. Not thought, just information arriving continuously from all directions. She was also, like her father, incapable of performing a position she didn't hold. This was the thing her mother had initially tried to train out of her and had eventually stopped trying to train out of her because the attempt had consistently failed. And Saravan, whatever her faults, was not a woman who repeated losing strategies. The joint Keth Terran Council had been meeting on neutral ground for 3 years. Progress, in the diplomatic sense of that word, had been made small, careful, easily reversible, the kind of progress that satisfies no one and collapses regularly and is rebuilt the next week and collapsed again. It was the architecture of a peace that was afraid to be a peace, afraid of committing to its own name, afraid that if it sat too still, someone would shoot it the way someone had once tried to shoot a queen in a corridor and had instead accidentally made everything complicated. And knew Cale walked into the joint session on a Thursday she was aware of. The Thursday she had chosen it. Deliberately. Her mother had told her the story once with the specific brevity she applied to things that mattered most, and Cale had filed it under Time's load-bearing details Times, and left it there until now. The room held 41 delegates, 20 Keth including 3 surviving members of her mother's original council, all of whom had opposed her existence and all of whom had, in the intervening 20 years, arrived at a complicated position on the matter that they would not have described as respect but that functioned like it, 20 Terran including 2 generals who had served against her father's regiment and were now sitting in the same room as his daughter and doing the specific math of that. 1 neutral arbiter from the Vile Compact, who had been managing this session for 8 months and had the exhausted precision of a person managing something that kept almost happening. Her mother sat at the Keth side of the table. Her father sat in the back row on the Terran side, white-haired, retired, wearing civilian clothes that he had never looked entirely comfortable in, watching her the way he watched everything. Patient, noting she stood at the center point, not the Keth side, not the Terran side, the center. My mother and my father, she said, and the room settled into the kind of quiet that precedes important things. Built the ceasefire from a hallway in a medical accident. A pause. She let it breathe. I would prefer something more durable. Then she sat down, opened the case in front of her, and began. What followed was not a speech. She had written no speech. Speeches were what you gave when you needed to move people who weren't going to be moved by facts. Everyone in this room was movable by facts if the facts were correctly applied. She had spent 3 years identifying which facts and how. She knew the Keth Council member on her left had a dynasty whose trade routes ran through Terran held space, and that every year of continued conflict cost his family's line in ways that his public position never acknowledged, but that his private communications, which she had read through channels she was not going to explain, made clear he had been calculating obsessively. She named the number, not as a threat, as a fact placed on the table, allowed to exist. She knew the Terran general 2 seats down had 3 grandchildren. She knew he had written in a letter that was technically private that he was tired of the question of what kind of world they were making. She did not quote the letter. She asked him the question directly in front of everyone and let him give an honest answer or a dishonest one. He gave an honest one. She knew Veroth's successor, the young hardliner who had inherited his political position and his general posture of determined opposition, had a biological anomaly in his hive resonance, a gap, a silence where the communion should have been full. She had felt it in the first session 3 years ago. She had said nothing, done nothing, waited. She brought it up now gently as context. There are things our categories miss. She said, I'm evidence of that, so are you. The categories are not the reality. He was very quiet for a long time after that. She worked for 4 hours. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She named what was true, what was costly, what was possible, and what would be lost by continuing to choose familiar conflict over unfamiliar peace. She answered every objection with a fact, not because she was indifferent to the fear underneath the objection, but because she had learned from her father that the kindest thing you can do for a room full of frightened people is to give them something concrete to hold. At the third hour, the neutral arbiter leaned to his aide and said something. Quietly, the aide wrote it down. The aide's face suggested it was the first genuinely useful thing the arbiter had seen in 8 months. At the fourth hour, the room changed. It was not dramatic. No one stood in declaration. No one cried. The change was subtler. A shift in how people were sitting. A shift in the back and forth between sides. A shift in the specific texture of the silence when someone finished speaking. The air of the room changed. Marcus in the back row felt it. He had spent enough time in enough rooms to know what that change felt like. He did not look at Saravan, he looked at his daughter instead. Saravan, at the Keth side of the table, did not look at Marcus. She was watching the room with the surgical precision she had always watched rooms, but her hands, the upper ones, were resting flat on the table in front of her, open, which was not a Keth formal posture. It was something older than formal. It meant she was listening genuinely, without managing the outcome. The treaty language was drafted that afternoon by a joint subcommittee that had, for the first time in 3 years, stopped renegotiating every clause from the beginning and started building from the last stable point. This was so unusual that the arbiter's aide marked the time in the session record as a notation. The signing was the following day. By nightfall, as Cale had told her mother it would be, the ceremony was not grand. Vale 9 was not a grand station. The viewport in the signing room showed the same stars it had always shown, patient, uninterested, the same ones that had looked in on a corridor and a medical bath and a plasma bolt, and all the rest of it. Someone had brought flowers from the Terran sections, hydroponics bay, and they sat in a container on the side table, slightly wilted, doing their best. Cale signed first her name in Keth script, then in standard, the two scripts overlapping at the center, the way two things could overlap if they decided to. The delegates signed. The generals, the counselors, even the one who had felt the gap in his resonance, who signed with the particular deliberateness of a man doing something he couldn't undo and had decided to do anyway. When it was done, people moved to speak to one another in small groups, the careful beginning of a new habit, and the room filled with the sound of it. In the back, Marcus sat for a moment before standing. He was slower standing these days. Everything was slower. He had a collection of old wounds that checked in with him every morning like employees reporting for duty, and he had made his peace with all of them. He was working his way toward the door when he felt her hand, the lower set, the one she didn't use in formal settings, Saravan beside him, her fingers finding his, the way you find something you put down a long time ago and are mildly surprised to discover exactly where you left it. She said nothing, he said nothing. They stood in the back of the room while their daughter talked to generals and counselors with the patient relentlessness of someone who had not finished yet and was not going to stop. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their long, unhurried business. The treaty existed now. It had a name and a date and 41 signatures and the weight of 22 years. Behind it, it had started as most things that last tend to start, not with a plan, with a Thursday, a corridor, Man who wasn't doing anything else.